The distinguished Swedish chemist Alfred Nobel made his name from the discovery and development of dynamite. When he died in 1896, he left one of the largest fortunes ever. In his will, Nobel stunned his family by insisting this fortune go to funding annual prizes for physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peacemaking. In his words, Nobel wanted to honor those who during the preceding year had conferred the greatest benefit on mankind. In this special program from the Royal Palace in Stockholm, we bring together many of this year's Nobel laureates from physics, chemistry, medicine, and economics. Welcome from me, Nik Gowing, to the King's Bernadotte Library, where the writer Strindberg was assistant librarian, and where scientists, philosophers, theologians and writers used to gather to study and to gossip about the major issues of the day. And it's a spirit we're continuing here on Nobel Minds. Here, Nobel Laureates for 2004 will share with us an insight into new intrigues about understanding how our brains work and the scientific and economic implications of maybe living much longer to even 110 or 120. Plus, with a rare woman Nobel Science Laureate, is the profession of science sexist? Well, before the laureates join me here at the table, let me outline the work that they've done and their great achievements as recognized by the Nobel Committee. The American professors David Gross from the University of California in Santa Barbara and Frank Wilczek from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology are the physics laureates. They identified and confirmed the bizarre properties of the ultimate fragments of matter known as quarks. Quarks are one-dimensional points with no mass inside a proton, and that is 1/10,000th the radius of an atom. The science is perhaps best understood with a simple rubber band like this. When it's not stretched like the quarks hanging around inside that proton, it's slack without much energy. Stretch it, and like the quarks trying to escape, the force gets stronger and stronger and grabs them over and over again like glue. Without this, everything on Earth would weigh nothing and fall apart. Well, in helping explain what happens deeper and deeper inside atoms, Gross and Wilczek have helped us to get closer to understanding the mysteries of creation. The chemistry laureates are Professors Ciechanover and Hungarian-born Avram Hershko from Israel's Institute of Technology in Haifa. They are Israel's first ever Nobel Science Laureates for their work confirming how to help us stay healthy by killing proteins to give life to a cell. This is a graphical representation of proteins inside our bodies, and some of them threaten to create diseases like cancer if they are not destroyed. Well, the chemistry laureates worked out how our bodies identify and tag those threatening rogue proteins as unwanted, then give them our body's kiss of death down there in a protein shredder. Identifying our body's quality control mechanism like this has had far-reaching implications for preventing and detecting cancers and conditions like leukemia or cystic fibrosis. The 2004 Nobel Prize in Economics has gone to Professor Ed Prescott, who divides his time between Arizona and Minneapolis, who shares the prize with the Norwegian Finn Kydland, who is now at the University of California in Santa Barbara, for their work on how people assessed the impact of government policy on their spending pattern. The economics laureates broke new ground by concluding that people make their decisions based on their assessment of the way the economy is going. In turn, that can mean that business cycles follow people's spending, not the other way around. Finally, Professor Richard Axel from Columbia University in New York and Dr. Linda Buck from the Fred Hutchinson Research Center in Seattle are the medicine laureates for defining the science of something we all take for granted, smell, and how we distinguish different odors. Remarkably, we humans can remember and identify some 10,000 smells. But until Axel and Buck's work, the nature of smells and its relationship to the brain and decision-making had been a scientific mystery. They identified the 1,000 genes that let us distinguish between great smells, like this hyacinth, to those less attractive smells, like this cyclamen, and even to pretty ghastly smells, like this 3-day-old crayfish, unpleasant smells that can stay with us indefinitely and alienate us from certain things for life. Axel and Buck discovered that the odorant receptors that distinguish one smell from another, like say between these two colognes in what's called the olfactory system, send an electric signal to the brain. And this helps explain how through smell we read danger warnings, how we identify fresh food like this sea bass, and even how a mother bonds with her newborn baby. Well, to get going, let's explore the implication of Richard and Linda's work on smell, especially what it tells us about the brain's ability to discriminate and to make judgments, and also the difference between people and species. Then, projecting ahead, we want to look at the brain and its implications for living longer, longevity of life, the survivability, and also what kind of productive life that will be. Now, Linda and Richard, before we get underway, let's do a little bit of testing. If we can pass it up to Frank, a little bit of testing on smell, and that Lily as well up there to David and to Finn as well. I'm handing out a few things for people to smell and just give their reaction to it. And this, if you can pass that up over there, please, Richard, to Avram. And one thing I'm not handing out, I have to say, is this Swedish dish, this delicacy called surströmming, which is in a tin. It's actually herring, which is also with yeast. And you can actually see it's bulging because it is something of a Swedish weapon of mass destruction, a chemical weapon, they say, because it is so awful to smell. And I'm not opening it here, so you're all saved that, although I think I can smell that cheese over there. Linda, what is going through the smell process and the brain process with your fellow laureates as they sniff? And you can open those bottles, by the way, Finn and Aaron.
Well, what's happening is that there are neurons in the nose, called olfactory sensory neurons, that have receptors on them that detect the chemicals that are released from these substances. So these chemicals are called odorants, odorous chemicals. They're volatile. So they escape from the substance, enter the nasal cavity, and they are detected by these neurons in the nose. And these neurons actually differ. There are millions of olfactory sensory neurons in the nose, and the different ones have different receptors.
Well, can we go to Frank? Frank, you've just been sniffing some Danish cheese, and you're not comfortable with that, are you?
Well, I think this was meant to warn people not to eat it, or at least that's my reaction. You couldn't pay me enough to eat this.
What is going on in Frank's brain as he smells that dreadful cheese from Denmark?
Well, it's very interesting that we do have very different reactions to odorants, and some of them are quite predictable. Most people do not like skunk. Most people like the smell of lily. And so one question that we've been interested in is, why is that? What happens in the brain? We found that humans have 350 different receptors in the nose that recognize these odorous chemicals or odorants. And each of the odorants is actually recognized by a combination of different receptors. And so those different combinations elicit different patterns of activity in the brain. And Richard has a movie that he's going to show.
Here, just a couple of images from inside a brain.
That illustrates this.
What's going on here? You've got a banana on one side.
Yeah, the central problem, as Linda has pointed out, is how it is that you translate chemical structures, which of course define each of the different odors, into something in the brain that allows one to distinguish which of the chemicals your nose is encountering. And that's what we have here. Apple on the left-hand side is causing the excitation of one set of neurons in a different position than is banana on the right-hand side, which is causing excitation of yet a different collection of neurons. And we can watch this in a living brain and demonstrate that indeed the quality of an odor results in different patterns of neural activity in the brain by activating neurons in different positions.
Well, you've talked about a unique lens into the brain, and we want to move on to how the brain is able to cope and what lies ahead. But what do you mean by a unique lens?
Well, each organism views the world in very different ways and creates its own selective picture, a picture that's largely determined by that which is important for the survival and reproduction of a species. So each species draws from the world different aspects of its environment. And what that means is that each species' brain is wired, is built in different ways to allow it to perceive different aspects of the world, so that each species looks at the world with, through the lens of its particular perceiving brain. What that means is that each species has to have an a priori knowledge of what it is going to be able to take from the sensory world.
All right, well, we've used your science really as a catalyst to look at the way the brain may be developing and our understanding. Frank and David, from the physics point of view, what's your view of the way this is moving forward?
Well,
particularly after what you've just smelled.
I think I'll pass on that, but we're mainly users of brains. It's very interesting and paradoxical in a way that we have to understand the basic components of matter, the ultimately simple parts. We use these very elaborate structures, sort of thinking back on their origins. I find that fascinating. I find it fascinating, for instance, that to calculate the mass of a proton, we use elaborate machines consisting of perhaps 10 to the 30th protons, working for months to figure out what the proton should weigh, where a proton figures that out every 10 to the minus 24 seconds, one proton.
But David, what about the business of mapping brains and so on, and the way ahead, and the way you're thinking about this?
Well, I'm hardly an expert, but this is one of the areas of biology where physicists are fascinated, because it's probably the hardest problem in science to understand the brain. And physicists are often intrigued by the hardest problems. Many have switched to trying to model the brain. I too regard it as one of the most fascinating areas of science, and clearly in its infancy.
Aaron and Avram, what are the implications for the kind of work you were doing on the proteins?
Well, proteins are doing everything. Even smells. So there is some connection between what we are doing and what they are doing. And if I can explain their work, I think that's the first glimpse into how the brain works. That is the real significance, as I understood, the work of these people, because the olfactory system, the smelling system, is one of the ways to approach how the brain works. How does it work? I think it will take a whole century.
A century, as long as that.
Well, that's my my feeling. Maybe you know better. But you have to approach it, and that's a great approach, because you have to find a good system in which it's approachable. So through the olfactory system, I think it can be approached. But eventually, it will come down to molecules. It will come down. It comes down already to proteins. To proteins that do the job. That do the job of smelling, but then also they do the job of memory and do the job of connections between nerve cells, which I guess are important in this thing. That's my.
But in the end, it's more than protein. I mean, we now have the complete human genome.
Yes.
And to put it in an interesting way, at a recent meeting we had, we were discussing the future of physics, which we're beginning to think about biology as well. One of my colleagues suggested as a challenge to get to the stage in genomics where you could put on an exam, you could give the students a gene, the sequence, and ask them to, as an exam question, to predict the shape of the organism. So even once you know where all the proteins are, where all the DNA sequence and the proteins that it produces, you still have to have the coherent understanding and to then predict what the shape of the organism will look like.
But what the genome is for is to make proteins. That is
Yes.
why it exists. And then the proteins have to be integrated in the whole organism. I agree
Well,
with that.
yeah, a prospect I find fascinating, and I'd like to hear from people more close to the situation, is the eventual possibility of second-order effects. That is, when we learn enough about the brain, we'll be able to make our brains function better, and then that'll feed back into itself and kind of into
Does that
possibly.
concern you?
No, I think it's wonderful, and we should also bring machines into the process with hybrids. We already do that, of course. We have some interaction with machines and immediate feedback from mathematical programs.
But I sound skeptical because of the moral implications of that.
Well,
Is that
it'll take
legit-
people smarter than ourselves to figure that out.
But isn't that already being done? I mean, one of the major contributions in medicine has been the pharmacologic treatment of psychiatric disorders. And a classic example is the effective use of antidepressants that is a consequence, at least in part, of a greater understanding of neurotransmission in the brain. Does that create ethical problems to give a drug to an individual to diminish...
Could there be some analog of steroids for the mind?
Aaron, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, David, you're right. That we are missing the coherent understanding. So, for example, the genome of the rice is much more complicated than your and mine genome. And just the simple linear information doesn't tell us the story. But at the end, it's going to be physical molecules, because when we die, and everything goes away. So I mean that even the higher functions, what Linda and Richard did, they found for us one layer, so they understand the mechanism of transmission, but they don't understand, or we don't understand, the interpretation of the smell, the memory, the feelings, the emotions that arise. So we understand the very basic layer. And the next one will be, but even this higher level, why somebody becomes a sculptor, why somebody becomes a painter, how we look. You know, we can all look at this library and everybody sees something completely different in this library. At the end, it will be molecules. I'm sorry to disappoint you that even our deepest emotions at the end are going, because when we die, it all goes.
No, but at the end it'll be quarks or strings. I mean, we're all reductionists to some extent, but we don't actually try to use the standard model or string theory to explain
Well, can you explain what you mean by that, that string theory?
We're all reductionists in the sense that biology is chemistry, and chemistry is, of course, atomic physics, and atomic physics is the standard model, and the standard model is string theory, and who knows where it will end. We're all reductionist in some sense, but it's not a very useful approach. And at the higher level of understanding how an organism works, I doubt whether you would deduce the shape of an organism from the genome by following in microscopic detail the reductionist path.
Linda,
There is a new buzz now in biology, which is called system biology, that you bring mathematicians and physicists in so they can tell you about how things are networking, but at the end, these are proteins and molecules that are networked.
And at the end, they're quarks and strings.
Linda, did Aaron describe correctly the limitations of what you've discovered so far in terms of the enormous...
Not limitation, I think it is the state of the art.
I think, yeah, absolutely. He's quite correct. And I think that there will be a role for physics in understanding and especially in developing new technologies. I think that a true understanding of how the brain is functioning is going to require new technologies to be developed. And I think that there are some people in physics and engineering now who are working on new ways to image the brain, not just at the level of a few neurons, but at the level of billions of neurons and many more synapses than that, the interconnections between cells. And I think there's that, the new technologies that will be needed to understand. And then I think also that we're missing something conceptually or maybe even philosophically that does not allow us to somehow conceive how neurons scattered in different parts of the brain could lead to a perception.
Consciousness.
Well, consciousness is another question, the self-awareness. That's totally not, it's not understood at all, of course. But even a perception where you might be able to someday image cells, maybe 1 million cells that are active at the same time in the brain, and those cells are required for perception. But how does activity in these distributed neurons result in a perception? It's hard to even imagine.
Let me pick up on something which I know has been of concern to you, which is infectious diseases between the age of 30, 40, 50. Then you have cancer between 60 and 70, but the potential now of cancer being no longer so big a problem and people really being able to live for maybe another 10, 15, 20 years, up to 100, 120.
Yes, I thought I came across this problem of longevity because of a really intelligent question came from a journalist about what is my dream. So I said that my dream is to wake up in quantums, to go to sleep now and to wake up in whatever, 100 years, and then to go to sleep again and wake up again, and so on and so forth in repeated cycles. And the reason being that I want to see, in the short term, I want to see these diseases that we are tackling today, like cancer and Alzheimer and, neurodegenerative disease being defeated. That's on the practical point of view. But I also want to understand the mechanism, why there is cancer, why there is Alzheimer, why we are losing memory, or why we are actually losing memory is not, it's one part of it, but why people see different things. I mean, why a patient can tell you that this book is a glove or a shoe. What happens to the brain that really that malfunctions? And then that we defeat it. But then it became even more philosophical, because I think always in biblical terms of the Tower of Babylon, of the human race trying to reach to God. And the turn of the century, people were living for 30 years or 40 years because they succumbed to infectious diseases. Then came streptomycin and penicillin, and this was a huge jump forward. Women were dying at delivery at huge numbers, and now they don't. We conquered this problem, and they didn't die of cancer. Why? Because they didn't live long enough to face cancer. So now we are facing cancer. And now we see also the next step in this Tower of Babylon. We see Alzheimer, neurodegeneration, which is the diseases of the 8th or 9th decade. And people predict that if we'll all live to 110, then everybody will have Alzheimer. Then we have to tackle this. Then we have to defeat this one. And that's how far our sight is going.
Well, can I explore the implications for all of you? David, you laugh about that.
Okay. Just one more second. And then I don't know what God prepared for us around the corner, because I cannot predict. But then there will be huge economic implications. Let's say that ideally we should live 400 years. There will be enough job for us, enough food for us. Bismarck invented this magic number of 65 for retirement. Now people, I'm almost 65, so what? I'm going to retire? I don't know, I hope not. So what people will do, and if our world become mechanized, you need now much less people in order to generate food.
Let's throw this to the economics experts. And Finn, you actually were offered a job where you would have to retire at 65, and you said, no way, because I don't want to give up work at that point. What are the economic implications?
I don't think there will be a problem with people living longer. The technology is there for input to result in enough output to and for people to be employed for until they're 60, 70, 80 years old.
Will there be enough jobs for everybody?
Absolutely.
What they're going to do?
That's never been a problem.
Well, you've meant to have the answers.
You may have read the player piano.
The French are thinking of shrinking the working week to 4 days now.
People have been working as many hours now as they ever have. There's no difference in that. People work more, they produce more output, and we have more to consume. There's no shortage of wants. There are going to be some interesting changes. When people are living longer, things are changing so fast. New technologies are coming along. We're going to have to educate people in general skills so that they can master new skills as they shift. It's not one career for your lifetime. You'll have to get a second.
But Aaron was talking about that word jobs. Are we talking about jobs in the future if we are living that long? Is it jobs or something else?
If people work more, they produce more. And if you have more output, you can consume more. Consumption may be better health care.
But cars can be made by robots, and everything is computerized. There will be enough physical jobs that people can wake up in the morning and go to work physically.
Reassure him, can you, Ed?
I'm a bit concerned, but you're not concerned?
No, historically, this has not been the case. We've seen 50 years trend. that was popular in the 50s actually, that view. And Kennedy came in and talked about retraining.
Everything is
right now, they've been replacing people with certain activities
but Ed and Finn,
freeing them up for others.
Can I be clear? Do you envisage people with Aaron's concerns at the age of 80 or 90 having full-time jobs? You call it labour supply, actually. You don't call it jobs. But can you see them being very positive contributors to the economy?
I don't know how healthy they will be. If they're healthy, yes. The brain does not degenerate. If they don't get the Alzheimer's, I don't see why they can't keep. I don't know that much about the way the brain will work and how well it'll continue to be able to go into new things.
Can you give us an answer?
I don't think there's any problem.
There's a very interesting biological perspective that is brought forth by our own ability to control our lifespan. That is, for most animals, the lifespan ends very close to when reproduction ends. And most species haven't had the ability to alter their lifespan as we may have in the coming decades. And so we are then beset with a circumstance where we are now living during a period when we may not be affording any biological or selective advantage. So some people would disagree with me and argue that the wisdom of age affords a selective advantage to a species. I find that a hard argument to accept right now. I think we're in a very interesting time when we are, through our own creativity and intellectuality, extending what was a biologically fixed moment in time. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Well, it's sort of the next stage of evolution. Natural survival need not be dying, succumbing to disease or predators, but to the social environment. And we're now in control of our genetic history.
But
more and more.
I think there is a limit to how long one can live, even if you eradicate disease. You have to ask why, when the human and mouse genomes are so similar, mice have a maximum lifespan of 2.5 years, and humans 120 years.
Well, because we had to educate our young. It seems there's
No, but I mean, in terms of what is it that determines that? I mean, in evolution, I'm not talking about evolution, I'm talking about why is that? What controls lifespan?
But that indicates that there are some kind of switches.
But
They're
theoretically,
there to be found.
Yeah, so the question is, where are they? What is it that
yes.
controls lifespan? Is it a subset of cells in the brain? Is it individual cells wearing out throughout the body?
But at the end, it's a physical problem because we are collapsing. Some system collapse. Let it be the cardiac system, the renal system, the brain. So if physically we shall find this problem, a solution for it, then we may be able to increase longevity.
That's right.
I mean, it's all about physical
if you
systems at the
understand
end.
what it
If we
is,
understand
yes.
it, then yes.
I wonder if we're thinking about this too narrowly. Well, I think what would be the most desirable is people live to a certain age, acquire knowledge, skill, wisdom maybe. Then maybe you could set back the clock so they have their physical bodies back at 20-year-old stage and most of their memories,
Like a
but not
timer
all,
system.
so they can, just have some partial, so just like...
Are you being realistic, Frank?
I don't know. No, I don't think it's, well, you have to think what you're aiming for. And then I think it's, when we're extrapolating 20, 50, 100 years in advance, I think it's unrealistic to think too small.
Aaron, can I just pick up on what we've heard from Ed? Reassurance, there will be jobs, there will be economic activity for all these people who you think might live to 80, 90, 100.
I wasn't reassured, I must admit.
You weren't reassured?
No, not at all.
Physicists.
But this is a social problem which we should be able to solve. From a different I'd like to make an economic point. When we build a building, it takes 2 years to build a new building. The building is supposed to last for 40 years. We rear our children, their education, university education, ends at the late 20s. And then they go on nowadays for a career of 30 years, it's an incredible waste. The natural span seems to me, with at the kind of level of civilization that we've attained, that we should live for 300 years. It's much more reasonable if you're going to make all this social, cultural investment in a kid through the 20s, that they should have a productive life for hundreds of years, not tens.
Richard, Axel, what's your view of this kind of discussion we've been having and the moral and potential legal implications, the debate going on in America at the moment? Or not?
Well, I'm not aware of a debate going on in America right now.
Is it going on behind closed doors?
There is at times a concern that our ability to understand so sensitive and important issues as brain function, emotion, cognition, memory, might lead to the generation of knowledge that some would argue, and I disagree strongly, is best left unknown. And I think that this reflects a deep misunderstanding of the intellectual, the scientific process. It's very important to understand how science is done. In science, you either want science or you don't want science. And if you want science, then you can't dictate or predict the outcome or the kind of knowledge that you will obtain. And certainly, some knowledge will lead to the good, and other knowledge has the potential for more troublesome outcomes.
Are you specifically referring to the brain here?
I'm talking about the brain, I'm talking about the physical sciences as well, and there are numerous examples. Perhaps the best example is Alfred Nobel's contribution, which is profoundly important but had potential destructive capabilities. And I think that knowledge inexorably will alter our lives and the lives of our descendants, and it's our shared responsibility, not only as scientists, but as a world, to see to it that that knowledge is both generated and used for the better.
Aaron.
Well, I couldn't have agreed with Richard more that there should be no limit to curiosity and to research. Absolutely no limit. And I believe that in democracies, then the checks and balances will make sure, or hopefully will make sure, that it's directed in the right direction. So, but the idea is maybe that more will join in, economists, clergymen, philosophers, not to help us, but to just see that things are looked upon in a more integrative manner, but absolutely no limits to curiosity and to investigating deeply the mechanisms that are there. I mean, I remember the discussions in the 80s about, molecular biology and cloning, and it was horrendous. I cannot imagine how we would have looked today if those recommendations would have been accepted. We would have been in Middle Ages back.
David.
This again emphasizes another point, that it's our responsibility to encourage the education of the general public in science. I mean, the democracies can only deal with these difficult issues and guide their development and application if people are informed of what science is and what the discoveries are. It's our responsibility and of our governments to do a slightly better job than they've been doing recently.
Ed and Finn, from the economist's point of view, how much do you feel you can be drawn into this kind of discussion, the multidisciplinary approach that we've heard being encouraged here in the last couple of minutes?
I don't see any reason for multidisciplinary, but one thing I want to echo back a little bit, there's tremendous resistance to anything new in the science. The only time that new things are accepted is after the old people die off. 50 years after Dalton's atomic theory. In chemistry, that's your field. The leading university in the world had people teaching the Flogen theory, the mixture theories. And the same thing as mathematics and economics.
But it seems we have an interesting problem here where a chemist says one thing about your concerns about longevity in the brain, and you're saying, no, he's got it all wrong. He doesn't understand the implications for the economic activity of people living.
Change. We got to have people shifting. You have to be retrained and go into some new area. People get locked into ways to think, and they We know from the philosophy of science, you can never disprove something.
Paraphrasing.
Avram.
I would like to rephrase it again or to explain it as again. So why are you not worried about longevity? Of course, from a medical point of view, but that's what we want. We don't want to live long. We want to live longer at a better health. That's common ethics.
You don't want to live to 120?
No, I don't know how much I want to live, but I would like people to live at a good health, as long as possible. And you say that's not a problem economically, and that's very important. Can you explain it to us, why?
First, there's never any shortage of things to be done, and people have longer productive life. They can produce more and enjoy life more. The one area I worry about is...
So the young people won't have to wait for jobs longer to be vacated? No?
Some of the youngest people are the most productive. Scientists in economics, including undergraduates.
Ed, I'm sorry to tell you, but you've contradicted yourself. You said that there were no bad economic implications of doing away with death. But then on the other hand, you, paraphrasing your mentor, Lord Keynes, said that science progresses from funeral to funeral. There seems to be a slight contradiction there.
Do you accept the contradiction?
I said we have to have something that term limits in a certain field. And then you have to move to a new field.
Because he was saying that, people could work, but...
just not contribute to science.
Well, they can work, but maybe new ideas will take longer to evolve. Because the older people, according to that idea, the older people would prevent the new ideas from becoming established.
But I think we have to have a clearer... To focus this discussion, we have to have a clearer idea of what longevity is. It means a very different thing if people just get older and frailer, or if they keep healthy, or even
and high quality of life.
Yeah, or
Quality of life.
do we have
then prevention of suffering?
or
for a
a
longer
step
time.
further? Do people retain their 20-year-old bodies till age 300?
But are you making very
And
Western
minds, for that
assumptions
matter.
here?
Yeah.
Okay, there's a medical issue, but what about the fact that in the Arab world, they say
very
they
different
have
discussions.
people alive now, young men, who are going to need 100 million new jobs by the year 2025. In other words, there's already pressure on economic activity, quite apart from the fact that there may be people around in a few decades who are going to live much longer.
I see no young men and young women are productive people, and they can just set up the system, and they're going to be producing like mad, and very quickly those countries are going to become, as if they do set up a decent system, as rich as Western Europe or the United States.
A problem in the United States, people are worried about outsourcing so many jobs to Asia. And they're worried about
trade and services. Question, are you in favor of free trade or opposed? The last time the world went against free trade was in about 1930, 31. What happened? The Great Depression. That's one thing that scares me about these anti-globalists. This is cooperative between nations. This will make, the rich countries benefit, but the poor countries benefit a lot.
Can I use this wonderful moment to try and look forward as to where you're going in your different disciplines? David, you've used a very interesting metaphor for the shelf, the ledge, which is at about 2 meters above ground, in terms of what you, as a scientist, are trying to do and what lies over that little horizon, which is just within reach, but not quite there yet. Let's explore where you think things are going from your science point of view.
Well, in fundamental physics, we're in an incredibly exciting time because we've learned so much that we're beginning to ask the really hard problems that have been asked forever. How did the universe begin? What used to be philosophy, we're beginning to ask about the basic structure of space and time, which used to be philosophy. In fact, there are many questions that when I was a student would have been sort of unthinkable to ask, illegal to ask. You couldn't have gotten a paper published on that. Are there extra dimensions of space? I don't think you could have gotten such papers into journals at that time. But now they've become physics questions, and once they're well-defined physics questions, we know that they will be answered. We don't know how long it will take, but we know that they will be answered. And some of them indeed probe to the deepest questions that physics has ever asked. How did the universe begin? Was it inevitable? Are there many multi-universes, parts of the universe that are inaccessible to us, that have totally different physical laws? Are there extra dimensions of space? Is space and time itself an illusion? As we've discovered, many other of our macroscopic notions of the world are sort of approximations to an underlying microscopic description that is pretty weird, and some of us suspect the same is true for perhaps the most basic notion of our physical world.
What are your
space itself.
Your funding requests say? I'm aiming to establish the foundation of creation and the universe.
Well, it's not illegal so far. Yes, no.
But this
people are allowed to ask these questions.
Okay, but this ledge you're talking about, just trying to reach something up there.
Well, so we can see sort of the ledge. The ledge represents those unanswered questions that are big and out there. There are aspects of the universe that are such as what causes its accelerated expansion that we've just discovered by observation, that we have no idea what it represents. And but we don't really know whether the ledge is just above us or 10 feet above us or 2,000, and we're reaching. And it's very exciting.
But is it the same in the other disciplines, in chemistry and medicine? This ledge, this eureka potentially, which is still up there, Linda?
Well, I think there are different kinds of questions. I mean, in terms of really advancing knowledge, I think that you have to take into account, as all good scientists do, what's possible at the time. And you try to reach as far as you can with what you're capable of doing at that time. And there's certain questions that you can't possibly answer, you realize that. So you try to stretch the knowledge as far as possible in your efforts. You accept a very challenging project, something that you think is important, and yet at least there's a possibility of answering a question.
Frank, what about your ledge up there, which you're aspiring to?
Well,
I'm hoping you can peek over.
I mean, David gave you some impression that there is a sense of optimism and excitement in physics now, but maybe I could say a little more particularly. One thing that's emerged in recent years is that most of the mass in the universe is in forms we don't know about, don't know what it is. Ordinary matter made out of protons and neutrons and electrons, the things we really understand well, makes up about 5% of the mass of the universe as a whole only. So there's, in fact, we know there are at least two different forms of exotic matter, one of which exerts pressure, no pressure, and the other exerts negative pressure. So really bizarre stuff. And we have some ideas about what in particular the zero pressure stuff might be, and maybe I think there's reasons for optimism to think that in 10 or 15 years we'll know what that is. The other is extremely mysterious.
Let me just move to something rather different, because here you are celebrating the distinction in your science and your disciplines. And before the program, we encouraged people out there, if they had any questions to you, to email them to us through the Nobel Foundation. Let me just put a couple of them to you. One of them, which came from David Wade in the United States. Here we are. There are 7 men sitting around the table and 1 woman. And it's very rare, I can tell you, having chaired Nobel Minds for many years here in Stockholm, it's very rare to have a woman. Is science sexist? That's the question. Linda, yes or no?
I think a lot of advances have been made in the last 40 years or so, mostly with laws that required that women would have equal opportunities with men. And now I'm talking about the United States. And I think that doors have opened for women in the sciences and probably in other areas. I think there's still some concern, though, that they're not open far enough. There are a lot of young women coming in to fields, but somehow there aren't so many at the top.
Is that a generational thing at the moment or not?
And, well, I'm not sure. I think it helps to have the new generations coming in because, but still there's, people wonder, why is it that women aren't advancing to the top levels?
Do you have an explanation? Is there some kind of ceiling,
No,
glass ceiling?
I mean, it's a glass ceiling that people refer to, but in the sciences, you can see that about 50% of graduate students and postdoctoral fellows are women. But you see, I mean, there's a huge decline when you get to the professorships. There are some assistant professors, but the higher you go, the fewer women there are. And I think, and I've thought about it a little bit, and one thing I think happens is that we've all been acculturated, and we've internalized ideas about men and women, and we don't even know that we're sexist. I mean, I have had male colleagues who thought they were feminists. They were ardently for women, and yet I could see that they were judging men and women differently. So I think
But
that...
did they know that they were judging them differently?
No, and they really they believed that they were not sexist, and I think that, so I think one thing that's important is to not just do our best, but actually to examine how we are behaving and make sure that we're doing well. And I think it's important that women are mentored too, because...
Well, gentlemen, should I ask you, is she right? Let's be honest here.
Well, in the biological sciences, Linda said that 50% of the undergraduates and postdocs are women. The physical sciences, the situation is much, much worse. The numbers in the United States are somewhere between 10 and 15%, and they've been increasing only at about 1 to 2% a year.
But this culture of discrimination, even though men won't admit to it, when it comes to tenure and promotion.
But my concern is that in the physical sciences, we aren't even getting the input of the younger generations, and that is because of culturalization. The laws don't apply to high schools and elementary schools where this culture, these cultural patterns are formed, and that's what we should be turning our attention to. I've actually seen this in practice, and that really needs examination. How the high school, middle school mentality somehow informs young women in the United States, at least, that mathematics, physics, engineering in particular are not for them.
Frank, is the male culture being diluted now or not? In your experience?
Well, it's happening slowly, but I think David is correct. The root of the problem goes very deep to the early stages of schooling and
but do you also recognize what Linda says about the fact that men say they're appointing women, but actually in reality they're not?
Undoubtedly, there are things we aren't aware of, but the conscious effort, I think, is very real to welcome women and treat them fairly.
It's not just the men either, it's also the women. I mean, you know, as David indicated, it's what women think that they're capable of doing.
Yes. And peer pressure.
Yes.
Among women or young girls to their classmates who happen to be brilliant nerds.
Right. There are movies about this.
Powerful.
Yeah.
Well, my experience and outlook is more optimistic. I'm teaching at a medical school, and it used to be 10 to 20% girls. Now it's more than 50% girls. So it's coming along, and I can see that in the echelons of the academic appointments also. I see more and more girls. It's true that it didn't reach at the higher echelons, but it will. And I see things that I didn't see. You know, I was trained as a physician at the Nobel Prize in chemistry, but actually I am in medical sciences. And there was no women surgeons when I was a student. Now there are many women surgeons. So I can see that it's coming along, and I think it's a matter of time.
But when it comes to research, and other women sitting around this table in future, can you envision? Envision that happening?
I will bet that in 20 years you will have 50% women sitting in this paper. So let's see in 50 years.
But
20 years. Yeah.
Is there a revolution in tenure and appointments and that kind of thing going on at the moment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I have a different opinion. I see no revolution over time. The supply has gone way up. And I've been very, very fortunate to co-author and work with exceptionally talented colleagues that happen to be female, but that's not a factor. Don't even consider that. But the supply over time has been going up quite dramatically, and that's great. More good students, the better.
And Linda, do you see nodding heads there, saying things are changing fast, particularly on tenure, appointments and so on? Do you see that changing?
They are changing, yes. But like I said, I think that one thing that people are not necessarily aware of is what they do without thinking about it. And this is true of women. It's not just men. It's also women evaluating other women. And I think a lot of it, as David said, derives from the education system.
What about the nationality in future? Because, of course, India and China are moving ahead at a fantastic rate at the moment. I was in India recently, and there I heard the finance minister talking about 10 to 12% growth over 10 years. Do you foresee that around this table in a few years' time there are going to be many more Chinese scientists, Indian scientists, not scientists from the United States in particular? And one of the questions here from Dr. Subhankar Ghosh from India talks about what are the scientific benefits now for underdeveloped countries? Do you see that paradigm changing dramatically fast? David, you're nodding.
Definitely.
Frank?
Definitely. If you walk down the corridors of MIT, you see Chinese faces, Indian faces, Asian faces of other kinds. That's the dominant composition of our student body.
Aaron?
Yes, absolutely. Now you see them at MIT, but the government are very smart government because they will pull them out from MIT and generate from them the conditions to come back to Hong Kong, to Shanghai, and to Beijing, and to develop their own. They will invest huge amounts of resources by bringing this nuclei of crystallization back into the country and generate their own culture there. And that's the idea, that they will not stay at MIT, and they're not going to stay at MIT. Right. They may, of course, nurture and, the American science, but at the end, they're going to develop their own countries because people are inclined to go back to their own culture.
Isn't that the way America's done it for many years, pulling in the best brains, and now it's China and India?
Exactly. And China is going to take back their scientists, I mean, many of them. And China probably will sure make it in a short time.
Richard, do you see that happening at Columbia?
Well, certainly we have an increase in the number of foreign students. I think that's good.
But do you feel under challenge, for example, from universities in Shanghai, in Beijing, in Guangdong? In other words, their excellence is rivaling an enormous institution like yours?
Certainly, but that just means, why are they here? They're here because we have a culture of science in the United States that has been extremely effective and productive. And I think and it is the role of science, to teach. And we do that well. The important message is that we continue to maintain a culture in the United States that draws the very good minds to our universities for training, and we're perfectly happy to share that culture and see it develop elsewhere.
But do you see a rivalry developing now with that teaching tradition and also the research tradition, which is no longer American-led, particularly in a nation like China and India eventually, 20 or 30 years from now? Avram?
Well, the rivalry, yeah, you always have rivalry. You cannot avoid that, But they also have cooperation, so hopefully the cooperation will be overcome the rivalry.
Rivalry is healthy. Think about Europe. Before World War II, Europe domineered the world. After World War II, it went to America. Now maybe America will stay. We cannot predict. So what about it? If it will be used by democracies in positive purposes, in good purposes, let it be. That's the world, about competition. You talked about this, that we shouldn't prevent any transfer, communication, mobility of scientists. Let it just evolve, yes, absolutely.
I think it's wonderful because many more people are going to be doing research. And that means that knowledge is going to advance more quickly.
Real good science needs democracy, needs freedom. Because we learned from old Russia that from time to time scientists surrender to the regime. They try to satisfy. We remember the old genetics era. In Russia, we need complete freedom to say what we say, to think what we think, and it will take, I think, more time in these different countries to change also their own culture and regime. So it's not just pouring $1 million into a university and recruiting some scientists to generate it. You need the real setup and the atmosphere and the networking and the freedom to move. I need a passport to do my science. You know, this simple blue document that will enable me to go to conferences, to talk to Linda, to Richard, to anybody. I mean, it takes much more than just a building and a few people working in. And so it will take more than a generation, I think. It's more complicated,
there is another argument that certain countries where some would say there isn't a perfect democracy by any means, where there's a degree of control, is also producing an extraordinary level of science and research because of the fact that politics is not getting in the way of it.
Yeah, you're right. You know, we talked about China. I think that even in China, it's my prediction, I cannot say, China also, in order to get to the helm, will need to take yet another step in its way of controlling things. Maybe they were smart that they didn't adapt the overnight change like the Russians have taken on their way to democracy, but even they will have to change a little bit and to remove the frightening, the threat that Chinese people have of going back, of what they say in the streets and so on and so forth. Because science is also economy, science is also archaeology and history and music and culture and museum. Science is not just, you know, test tubes, and it takes this wonderful interaction, and you need to have it in the right setup.
Well, can I thank you all very much indeed, 7 men and 1 woman laureate, for being with us here in the King's Library in Stockholm. It's been a very rich discussion. We hope we have highlighted some of the major issues in science and in economics and what lies ahead, the uncertainties that lies ahead, but the great excitement of what lies ahead as well. We've charted the change and predicted what may be on that ledge. From me, Nik Gowing, and all the laureates here in the King's Library in Stockholm, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye. Thank you.